not on there. The mic 4.
All right, good morning, round 2. So I would invite Virgil Stucker up, who's going to be doing our second hour today on mental health. And while Virgil's introducing himself and his extensive resume, come on up, I'll pass out a handout for today. So you'll have a resource, and those joining on live stream, we emailed it out this morning. Oh, yeah, that would help.
What are the rules? Can I take this off while I talk?
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
And you can take the microphone out of there as well, because it needs to be pretty close to your mouth.
Oh, okay. It needs to be close to my mouth. Hello, microphone. Okay. So you can hear me? Oh. Okay. Now you can hear me. That's so good to be heard. Well, thank you for this opportunity. What was passed out is a list of some of the topics we might have a dialogue about, and I'm hoping it's sort of dialogical. Maybe as you get a chance to glance at that, I was just thinking early this morning, a lot of my life, our life, Liz and my life, has been sort of living very close to mental health issues. I'm remembering that actually my sort of calling into this world of mental health care started 54 years ago. It's hard, even though I'm only 45, right? But 54 years ago, I thought my life was going into a certain path. I'd been working on that for a long time. And then I was shocked by a friend of mine who in Vietnam could not stomach dropping napalm on people and instead flew his plane into the side of a mountain, killing himself. That's the first suicide that had ever rocked my world. And so I went into a different direction. In college, I was a volunteer probation officer for young people in prison, some of whom had mental health issues. I was also a tutor for a young boy with autism. So that sort of made me a bit more fascinated about maybe being called into mental health work. And then after college, one of the first jobs that I had was working in the psychiatric wing of a general hospital. That was eye-opening. I remember, they said one of the jobs you can do because you're sort of calming. You can talk to people when they're coming out of electroshock treatment, trying to reorient them. So I did that, and then one day I remember being called, and there's this fellow who's out of control. You have to tackle him and put him in 4-point restraints. I didn't know what those were, but I found out. I'd never done that to another human being before. After that, went down to the chapel and just cried. And I thought there must be a better way. So actually, Liz and I met at one of those better way places in 1976, a place called Gould Farm up in Massachusetts. It's really the country's oldest therapeutic community for people with serious mental illness. So it took us a few months to get married, and our lives were sort of intertwined with therapeutic communities thereafter, starting their Gould Farms Boston program. And then we really liked the therapeutic community model. This is dealing with people with serious mental illness, and went to Richmond, Virginia to help set up a similar model. And then next to Michigan to set up a similar model called Rose Hill in a little town called Holly, Michigan. I don't know if that's near, if you know that area, Lisa. And then when we moved to this area back in 2003, goodness, Cooper Reese will be 20 years old next year. We came down for the purpose of helping to establish Cooper Reese, which some of you may know locally as a therapeutic community for people with mental illness. So I think about, how professionally sort of being drawn into that has impacted our lives. You heard from Megan in her sermon about the huge percentage of families that deal with mental illness. It's like, who doesn't? I'm thinking about, like in my life, I remember once unsuccessfully trying to stop a suicide and having to be treated for post-traumatic stress disorder for about 9 months. A few months ago, my father died, 103 and a half, had a great life, but since then, of course, trying to help my mother with her grieving process. And this summer, Liz and I are soon to have our 9th grandchild, but part of our daily conversation is about 2 of our grandchildren who have mental health challenges. So it's like, who doesn't face something in their own lives and in their own communities? We do. We have. And as Megan had pointed out, I still work a bit as what's called a therapeutic consultant. I help families find mental health care and actually also run a support group for mothers. So still keeping somewhat involved, working very hard at being retired. Not quite, but a lot better, right, Liz? Okay. So I was thinking, what could I offer today? Didn't get questions, but I thought maybe some would come up while you're here. I wrote down, I thought, what is it I know after all of these years? And first, again, this is dialogue, right? If there's any topic here sort of jumps out at you and you say, hey, Virgil, what about this or what about that? That's great, let's talk about it. But until you raise your hand, maybe I'll just start going through a few things. So, point 1, how do you sustain mental health? Of course, that's almost like saying, how do you sustain physical health? But there are a couple of things that I think we really need to pay attention to in our own lives and the lives of those that are around us. Number 1, we always need to be paying attention to our sense of belonging and relationship. Isolation, loneliness, that fosters mental illness. And mental illness is, it's like a dis-ease. You get disengaged from that flow of life. So you want to be in the flow, having a strong sense of belonging and relationship. Secondly, a sense of meaning and purpose. I look around here and I think about all of you and all of the good things you do in the world around you. That gives you a sense of meaning and purpose, right? So, and some research shows us that if you have a strong meaning and purpose in your life, you're less likely to take your life. So that's one of the studies in regards to suicide. That if you really believe when you wake up in the morning that the world needs you and you have something to contribute, you're likely to continue contributing. Thirdly, you need to pay attention to resilience. Resilience is that thing we sort of need when we get knocked off track, right? Who has never been knocked off track? Of course, we all have. And resilience helps us get back up on track. And there are different ways to address that. Right now we're seeing a lot of issues regarding resilience in our young people. I wish we could teach it in high school. So those three things, does that resonate a little bit? Okay. I'll move on to point 2. Unless someone wants to add any other point to point 1. All right, point 2. Understanding diagnoses and symptoms. There's a diagnostic manual. Used to be about so wide, and now it's about so wide, and it's getting wider. I know some of the psychiatrists who have been creating it, and it's amazing how many diagnoses there are, and also how many medications are attached to each diagnosis. I'm not saying that medication isn't good, but sometimes I'm wondering which comes first. But diagnoses, if you think about psychiatric or mental health diagnoses, it's like if you have 4 of the following 7 symptoms, you end up with a diagnosis. Could be a diagnosis related to anxiety, depression, etc. But it's unlike like a cancer diagnosis. You might have a tumor. It's right there, you see it. Mental health diagnoses can change over time. Over time, you might not have the same diagnosis, and you might not have any diagnosis. We are changeable. So ponder the fact that mental health diagnoses are not always, quote, cast in stone forever. Depending upon how you respond to those, you can recover, and you can eventually leave those diagnoses behind, or at least they just become a small part of who you are. Too often, if you get a diagnosis and a name, it sort of is like a label that goes on you, and it's like, no, that's stigma. It's like you don't say to someone with cancer, oh, you're cancer. No, you don't say to someone with mental illness, oh, you're a schizophrenic. You may be someone who has a psychotic illness or a mood disorder, but that can become a smaller and smaller part of who you are as you manage it and recover. So some of the symptoms I've listed here, anxiety and depression. What are they? It's sort of like 2 sides of a coin. Anxiety is when you really get stuck worrying about what's going to happen. Depression is sort of like worrying about what already happened. And if you got both of those, whoa. But they're both mood disorders potentially. And the stronger you are disengaged as a result of your symptom, the more likely it is you end up with a diagnosis. Because all of us will have some days of anxiety, some days of depression. That doesn't mean that we are diagnosed with a depressive disorder. Psychosis. What is psychosis? Think about how we generally think. It's like we can think sequentially in our minds. We make plans. It's all sort of clear. Sometimes there can be intrusions that knock us off a little bit. We get back to our thought process. But for those of you who are old enough, remember when you used to turn channels and you would get sort of fuzz between the channels? It's like sometimes that's a little bit like what psychosis is. It's like, whoa, there's all this noise. And it's frightening. It's like, whoa, what's happening to me? Or your consciousness can sort of be fractured, and your thoughts might even come to you as a voice or something you see that isn't really there, a hallucination. Those are what's called the positive symptoms of psychosis. Because you see them, you feel them. Negative ones are what you don't see, like sometimes loss of motivation. Crystal. Is that becoming a what? Can it come in your dreams? Psychosis is generally, the symptoms of psychosis are generally what you refer to as symptoms that arise during your waking hours that disturb your ability to progress. And Oliver Sacks, who is a friend of mine, said, about 10% of all of us experienced a psychosis at some point in life. Hearing voices, hallucinating, doesn't mean that it's persistent, but 1 out of 10 will experience some kind of psychotic feature at some point in their lives. Paranoia can sometimes be a part of a psychosis. Imagine you can't really think clearly anymore. You are hearing these voices or having delusions. That's really scary. So paranoia can naturally arise. Self-harm can occur in relationship to mental health diagnoses. Sometimes it's cutting, is what it's called, and finding more of that with young people. Sometimes it goes along with a diagnosis of borderline personality disorder, other disorders. Sometimes it's really a call for help. And oddly enough, sometimes people do it to relieve their pain. Trauma, I think we know what trauma is, and if it's severe enough, there can be full-blown post-traumatic stress disorder. And we hear that a lot with our servicemen, servicewomen, right? One of the things that's contributing to increasing suicide rates there. Splitting behaviors, narcissism, that's sort of in part symptoms of personality disorders, it's called. Personality disorder is sort of what you experience with a person who has almost an unfillable void. They just, no matter how much you try to give them, they can't fill it. And, sometimes the way they react will split people off from one another, or, the narcissist can, well, we know some of those in our lives. Some of them make it into politics also. Won't go there anymore. Okay. Anything else go to, yes, go ahead. I'm sorry. Yes, Linda.
In my 20s, I finally went into therapy for myself, and I had a low-grade chronic depression, and I had an almost perfect childhood and adolescence and so on, and I couldn't understand it at all. And but it turned out there were things. I'd repressed anger all my life, and that had built up in me. I didn't know how to handle it, and here I was helping other people. But the other thing is that I had, through the years, off and on, I'd have a new client would come in and say, I want to apologize for using your time because nothing bad happened to me when I was a kid, and I just can't help it. I've got this depression. So it was something that I understood. And that's something that can just be chronic and can turn into some of these other bigger things. Mm-hmm. So we need to not write it off too quickly when somebody talks to us about feeling stuck or depressed and so on, mm-hmm. because a little can go a long way mm-hmm. with a lot of stuff.
Yeah, so always like asking someone, how are you? And then listening seriously. Depression, can come as, you sort of feel this person is really down. You see a down mood. You sort of see it in their face. You can feel it almost in their presence. The other side of depression often is anger. So it's odd that anger could actually be a symptom of depression, but, that's one of the indicators that you'd want to look at. I don't know that we've met, but this gentleman had a question.
Hey, I'm Jeff. This is Karen.
Hello, Jeff.
One really common problem when you try to, with good intentions, try to help people, but you don't totally understand the problem, is that you end up doing something that you think is empathetic, but actually doesn't do any good or actually does some harm. And when I look at the list of symptoms, a lot of personality disorders and anxiety-related disorders are a matter of degree, right? People look at this and they think, well, I know what half of this is. I do this every day. I have some, I might have a moment I think, did I leave the oven on, or I don't feel like getting up and doing anything today for no good reason. I mean, everybody thinks they can relate to some of the things like anxiety and depression. And then there's ones on here that the average person thinks, well, I don't do that, right? I mean, I don't have psychotic thoughts, or, I haven't experienced trauma or something. So you tend to think there are some of these that as part of human nature, and some of these that are more extreme. And so Karen and I have been married for 26 years and had to do a lot of intentional work about accommodating each other's particular mental health issues, and they're both anxiety related. Mine's a little more personality, but the problem is when we tell people what we're thinking, what we're stuck on, what we're going through, people are like, "Oh, I do that all the time. That's normal." I mean, and then so the first thing you do is, "Well, never mind then," because the disorder comes in based on how much it intrudes into your daily life and how much it takes over your train of thought. When most people see things as, that's a distraction I have to get over as part of human nature. I'm talking about this is the thing that's orchestrating my entire day, is making my decisions for me. It's making me late to things or not very effective. And it stood out sort of the most for us in how people would try to give marriage advice when they don't realize what's running the marriage issues are these things that are to a different degree than the average person experiences in their marriage. So it's especially unhelpful if somebody goes, "Well, y'all will get through that. Every married couple deals with that." And that's, people think, well, that's a step better than just saying, well, if you pray, it'll go away. And they're trying to be empathetic and realize this is a thing that you continue to experience. But really it turns out to be no help, because you think you have advice for this, but you aren't hearing the problem. You don't really understand what you think you understand. So I think I've tried to apply that when I think about other people. We have several people in our lives with brain trauma, and you think, well, I mean, I get confused too. That's no help. This person actually has a brain injury. Right. So I was just thinking about that matter of degree and empathy that's not really helpful.
Right. I really thank you for bringing that up, because how we respond to people when they open up is really important. Concept you provided, you said, when this really disorders your life, like serious depression, sometimes people who are seriously depressed can't get out of bed, or they're really anxious. They can't get out of the house. They may literally not be able to get out of the house. I mean, it's like a spectrum. And with mental illness, I think it's important to understand it isn't, again, like cancer, there's the tumor. It's a spectrum. And the further you are along that spectrum toward not being able to continue the sense of belonging and relationship, sense of meaning and purpose, and you've lost your resilience, you're knocked off track, you can't move forward into the ordered life you want, then you're more likely to have a diagnosis. While we do want to be a, quote, wise community and surround people with love and hope, what I think you point out is that when someone is expressing themselves, we first need to listen. And then secondly, we need to listen. They're not looking for our advice. You're not looking for advice. You want to be heard. You want to be seen and understood. So I think our response is when we say, well, how are you? And you say, well, I've got this. We don't say, oh, well, I had that yesterday. No, I'm fine. I mean, that's not helpful. It's harmful. Our response can be, well, tell me more. We get anxious about that because if we hear more, it's like, whoa, what do we do with that? Well, that's part of what I would also like to offer. Let's if we could, let's jump to C. Yes. Oh, sorry. Diane?
Yes. I have a young man who, let's see, he has an issue with eating, and I'm not sure if it's a mental health issue or an eating issue. but he can never fill himself up. And that's what brought to mind when you said, I know we've had people who collect things that can't bring enough stuff into the house. They can't do a lot of things, but he can't fill himself up with food.
Okay.
And
Well, there are some, I'm hearing eating disorder potentially.
well, I'm not sure. I'm not sure if it's a depression thing or if it's an eating disorder. I'm not sure.
Okay, so you are now helping me segue perfectly to item 3. Because we're not sure sometimes when we observe or when we see, and sometimes 3A is like, is the problem clear? Is an assessment needed? There are disorders where someone, they cannot stop consuming food. There are classic eating disorders, and yes, some are associated with mood issues, anxiety, depression. But depending upon how serious it is, then professional assessment may be needed. I'm going to give you, as we get down through this, some ways to help someone get a professional assessment. So that's where it starts. Sometimes it's like, okay, what's going on? We need to clarify things. Don't rush to judgment. Unfortunately, generally when someone has a full-blown crisis, they'll end up in a psychiatric wing of a general hospital, not even a psychiatric hospital. And they immediately have to have a diagnosis. Why? So that the insurance will cover it. They immediately have to have medication. Why? So that the insurance will cover it. That does not mean that the diagnosis is accurate or the medication that's prescribed is helpful. And insurance requires it. What I have found over the years is without that assessment, without clarifying things, some people will go for decades improperly diagnosed. I've run into some cases like that where I've helped them get an assessment and it's like, oh, it's not this, but it's that. And the course of treatment immediately changes things. So assessment is important. Also, as you're listening to someone, 3B, it's like, what is the level of the issue? Level of acuity? Is it a crisis? So you're holding that in mind. Also, 3C, it's like, is this a real complex issue? By that, today, we generally mean, is it a mental illness combined with substance use? Because there's so often co-occurring issues that are arising. For example, with young people, I worked with a young man coming from a very prestigious hospital who was diagnosed with persistent schizophrenia, and the more I listened, it's like, wait a minute. This fellow was using a lot of marijuana, and especially for a young adult brain, young male brain, that can trigger psychosis. So he was already misdiagnosed on a path of having persistent schizophrenia, which he didn't. So he got into a different path and is now an electrician and living on his own. And not that he doesn't have some mental health issues, but not misdiagnosed. So complexity is important. 3D is really important. It's like in our conversations with people, we might see already that they're having trouble. We might listen, see that they're having trouble. It's like, do they really want help? Are they willing to get help? Because you can have what's called denial. Families will sometimes, deny, this is not a real issue, it'll go away. And the person may say, who, me? I don't have a mental health condition. I don't want help. And they can spiral down. So look at those 4 different factors under 3. And it's not that they're sequential necessarily, they're interrelated, but you're always looking at assessment, level of acuity, complexity, willingness to participate. When I work with families, and I've worked with about 250 over the last 4 years, as I listen to their issues, I go down this list, 1, 2, 3, 4, in order to say, well, here are options. So how do we help others? That's point 4. And this isn't exhaustive. But as we're listening to people or observing our own needs or our family's needs, 4A, this is a pretty good way to find a therapist. Psychology Today, you get on that website, put in your zip code, and it will show you local psychotherapists and psychologists. And you never just say, well, I'll pick that one. You need to do like an interview, check a couple of people, ask others who, may use them. But that is one way. Like I did that for zip code 28782, and there are a lot of choices. There are public services that you can call, 4B, Polk County Mental Health Services. Sometimes there's a crisis and a psychiatric hospital may be needed. If at all possible, always use a psychiatric hospital, not the psychiatric wing of a general hospital. General hospitals always lose money on their psychiatric wings. I used to help run a hospital system. I looked at those statistics. During COVID, a lot of these units have actually shrunk. Conveniently, in a way, and they're probably not going to reopen. There's already a shortage of beds. But look for a psychiatric hospital. Here are 2 that I recommend locally. Carolina Center for Behavioral Health in Greer, South Carolina. And there's one near Charlotte. It's actually called Davidson Hospital. It's part of the Atrium system. There are 2 numbers there. But if there's a need for hospitalization, those would be the 2 local ones that I would go to first. Sometimes beyond hospital, someone might need more intensive care, sometimes residential care. That's what Liz and I have been involved with for decades. 4D, there's a group I helped form, goodness, it's 20-some years ago, ARTA USA. It has a whole bunch of residential programs on it that I think are pretty good. That some are nonprofit, some are not. Also, you can get a lot of information from NAMI and Mental Health America. So I've given you 2 websites there. If you take a look at their web pages, you'll find that they have a lot of data, a lot of good information. So 4F, what happens in a crisis? Well, if it's a truly life-threatening crisis, you might call 911, but then you also have a hope and a prayer along with that. Because police are so often not really trained to deal with a mental health crisis. When I was at Cooper Reese, we used to train the county folks, but I'm not sure that's happening anymore. But still, if it's life-threatening, 911, and then if police are coming and you're there, and you know that the family member you may have called for, has a mental health condition, you're trying to help the police understand that, understand what works. I've seen some great police work, sometimes not. There's also VIA Access Center. They have an 800 number you can call 24/7. That's on there. Mobile crisis teams. There is one. Takes them a couple of hours, though, to get here. There's their number. Family Preservation Services. I don't know exactly what they have, but I know that during the regular hours, they have some kind of crisis support that they can provide over in Columbus. If you're worried about someone maybe they're thinking about suicide, the suicide hotline is actually changing nationwide, I guess, as of July 16th. 4G gives you this 988 number where you can get advice and they can direct you to local resources. And by the way, if you're worried about someone maybe thinking about suicide, ask them. You are never going to cause someone to commit suicide by asking them. Ask them, are you okay? Are you thinking about hurting yourself? You might be worried about what the answer is, but I'm trying to give you some information here to help them with an answer. Oh, and thinking of resources, I brought a stack of these. I think there might actually be enough for most of you. 15 are up here. It's a little book that one of our daughters and I wrote a little over a year ago called A Family Guide to Mental Health Recovery. What you need to know from day one. So it's for sale on Amazon, but today it's really cheap. It's for free. So if you're welcome. Yes? Yes.
The training is very practical,
Mm-hmm.
very, very helpful. And I would encourage anyone who has a lesser problem, let's say,
Mm-hmm.
to try to find someone with that family therapy training.
Mm-hmm.
Even if you're going to work with an individual and not like have the whole family or the whole couple come in, the concepts, the understanding, and the way of working, I've done a lot of things, and that's really one of the best.
Is it the person generally has, what's it called, LMFT, Licensed Family and Marriage?
There are a few
Therapist.
things.
Yeah.
I was a licensed clinical social worker,
Okay.
but then I got the training for family therapy on top of that.
Okay.
But
Okay. And generally, this first 4A, if you look up, psychologists, gives you therapists. It'll give you their picture. It'll give you a description of their primary areas of work. So very important, Linda, that for those who need not just individual but couples family therapy, that can be found there. Okay. Any other resources people might? Okay. I would just also point out that in addition to the little booklet that you're welcome to have, and actually this is pretty readable. It started out about 300 pages, and Liz says, you're philosophical. You can generally say things more simply, so I hired a really good editor that turned it into something that is less philosophical, more practical. So, and then I've got a whole bunch of web podcasts. If you go to my website, I've had a chance to interview some really good people nationally in mental health, and they're all on my website if you want to listen to those. Under point 5, I mentioned grandchildren, one another, family members in cognitive decline. I'm thinking of my mother. Probably some of you have folks in your mind that ourselves, right? Yeah, some of us are getting older. And then maybe under 6, and then I'll just sort of go over this and see if there's any additional discussion. Some of this goes hand in hand with some of what Megan was bringing us before with data. So, how are we doing for the needs of people with mental illness? Individually, maybe pretty good, depends upon the person. Nationally, not so good. We have about 600,000 people with mental illness in prison and jail. We have 1 out of every 112 people in prison or jail in this country. It's the highest population anywhere in the world. But 600,000 are people with mental illness. And some of the jails, like the Los Angeles County Jail, is the largest mental health provider in the country. 250,000 people with serious mental illness are on the streets, homeless. So, we could be doing better. Mentally ill slain by police. And, you know, goodness, I'm pro-police. We need police, but we need to make sure they're trained if possible. There's good training. I'm looking at some data that is kept by the Washington Post. You know, during this last year or so, we've of course become concerned about racial issues and people who are African American who are slain by police sometimes. Well, the numbers are about the same. People with serious mental illness are being slain by police at about the same rate, and neither is acceptable. So we need more training, of course. Increasing levels of suicide, you know, almost across every age category. Especially now, young girls really spiked. It does. I think there was a New York Times article this last week that basically concluded that there's no causal link necessarily. But if you go back to paying attention to a sense of belonging, sense of relationship, social media can disturb that. So it depends upon the individual. Under thinking about suicide, 6E, guns and suicide. Not everyone knows this, but I want you to know it. Of course, we get very concerned when we hear about something like what happened in Buffalo yesterday, right? The last year we have really good statistics so far as 2020. 54% of the gun deaths in this country, 23,262, were suicide by gun. 54% of the gun deaths are suicide by gun. Having a gun in the home is a risk factor for suicide. Suicide too often is an impulsive act. People who survive it often say, oh, I'm not going to do that again. With a gun, you generally don't survive. So either don't have a gun in the home, or if you have it, double lock it, make it harder to get to impulsively. Yes, I'm concerned about the people who are dying by guns, like in Buffalo. But where is the concern about the fact that the majority of gun deaths for a number of years, not just 2020, the majority of gun deaths in this country are by suicide? And that's increasing for women, it's not just men. So, sorry to burden you with that, but you need to know that. And then 6D, we have some anxiety in an age of uncertainty? Maybe. But it's impacting, and you know, your heart goes out to, especially, I mean, young people. I think about our grandchildren, they're looking at the world they're coming into, and pandemic, and climate issues, and it's, gosh, we have to keep, they are our hope for the future, and we have to support them, strengthen their resilience, get them off the screens, get them into belonging, and find a sense of purpose, so that they too can have long, fulfilled lives. And we've got some anxiety too, probably. Who doesn't? Linda doesn't.
I just want to say that there is a lot of healing with the Holy Spirit. Mm-hmm. And there are some therapists that include that in their work. Mm-hmm. But I've seen things heal after years and years of therapy and doing the traditional thing, finally heal mm-hmm. when there was really healing prayer coming in. And people aren't all that open to it, but it's just an amazing thing, when you try all these tried and true things, and finally, what does the job is spiritual healing.
Mm-hmm. Let's sort of, Yeah, on that note, I love that as a place to be. Because almost all mental health issues have a spiritual component. So we need to address that. And healing can occur in almost all mental health conditions. That's what Liz and I have been sharing our life. We've been sharing our life with thousands at this point of people who've gone through serious mental illness and may not be, quote, cured, but leading lives of recovery where they have full, filled lives of functioning, meaning, purpose, belonging. Quick story. This is a good note story. Thursday, I was visited by one of my clients. I knew him first when he was in the hospital with psychosis, and I've known him now for a couple of years. He's now been in Asheville for a couple of years, and despite the fact that he's still someone who has a diagnosis of psychosis and takes medication regularly for that, he just completed 12 courses at UNCA, straight A's, no A minuses. He just performed in Shakespeare's Twelfth Night as Duke Orsino, and he came down Thursday, and I got to spend 3 hours with him and his beautiful, fabulous girlfriend walking around town. He's open with her, and they've got such a relationship. It just gives me such hope. You know, this is a young man who could have been sort of pushed aside, could have been one of those 250,000 homeless, but he's not. So we never give up. We always have hope, and people with serious mental illness can achieve phenomenal results in their lives. I've seen it over and over. So, other questions?
I just wanted to say more about the healing prayer. There is training for healing prayer, and it's for physical and mental. You know, it's just like what Jesus did. Mm-hmm. And there's some good training around there. And there's a group at the Episcopal Church I'm part of that is practicing healing prayer. Mm-hmm. And our church could get into more healing prayer, teach some things and so on. Mm-hmm. And that's something we could offer.
Well, that sounds good. I know today is sort of highlighting Mental Health Month, but we're a wise congregation, and maybe the dialogue will continue, and we'll find different ways of being supportive. Hello, Donna.
Hello. I want to share another happy story with you. A young man, he is my son-in-law's nephew, was at Coparees, had tried everywhere, everything, and he had such a successful experience there that now he is married and has a baby. And It's just the most incredible thing that to see where his life has come.
Well, thank you.
So thanks for that wonderful place.
Oh, goodness. Well, I'm glad that you shared that story. Thank you. Yeah, the Coopers, of course, are the ones that we thank, Don and Elizabeth Cooper, for the existence of the place. Great philanthropists. But Liz and I are glad that we had, 13 years there and helping get the place going. So, thank you. Anything else? Jeff, you've got something?
Well, I just had a question in addition to the resources you talked about. And you mentioned briefly, like the family members in cognitive decline, and you mentioned people's willingness to get help. Is there a resource for helping one generation figure out how to talk to the older generation about what they now need that they may be in denial about needing? There's a lot of elder care resources. There's a lot of things like support groups for people that with Parkinson's or things like that, and all those are helpful, but having the actual conversation with someone who's headed toward needing.
I'm just looking it up because I had that exact question in relation to my mother, and I emailed the nursing home a resource I found. Give me 1 second. Oh, our internet here isn't real fast. When it pops up, I'll give it to you.
So specifically, the situation we have in mind is where the mother, it's Karen's
Okay.
parents. Yeah.
Okay.
So Karen's mother isn't to the point with Parkinson's yet that she needs to be in a assisted living, and we don't know for sure because of Parkinson's whether she will end up there at that point of need in 5 years, 10 years, or ever. But Karen's dad has a brain injury where he did okay and plateaued for a while. The brain injury came after he was already, after he was 60 years old.
He turned 60.
Yeah, so it was already fairly late in life. So now in his 70s, he's already to the point he needs memory care to a much different degree than Karen's mom. So the problem is, how do you deal with the fact that as long as her mom doesn't need it, they probably aren't likely to go anywhere, because then her mom tries to continue, keeping her and her dad self-sufficient. So you have two different degrees of need that may end up converging eventually, but it's still, they're fairly young to be having to accept that they need to go somewhere with more immediate care.
But just in the recent weeks, it's become worse with my dad, so to the point of I'm worried about her safety, because he is a gun collector, and he wears one all the time in the house.
Oh, gosh.
So I've talked to some people about looking into facilities. My mom doesn't need one, but her mental decline her mental decline is beginning now. It's not, like Jeff said, it's not terrible, but she's constantly stressed because she's worried about my dad. Parkinson's requires you to not be stressed. So I have to talk to them about it. And I was just, I need a resource that kind of is a transition from let's talk about assisted living or let's talk about independent living. I need something that is sort of a transition into that discussion, because they're nowhere near thinking we need to go somewhere. They're nowhere close to, and my dad is angry. He's going to get angry about it. So I guess I'm just scared about it.
And I have a couple of responses. The website that I found in regards to, I was wanting some advice for certain issues my mother's having with her cognitive decline, agingcare.com, seemed like it had some good sort of responses to questions like that. Depending upon the level of acuity, remember looking at assessment, level of acuity, willingness to participate, you're sort of going through that cycle. Depending upon how dangerous it becomes, you might eventually even have to have some kind of intervention. But another huge resource, I won't put her on the spot, but I know that Lisa has a huge heart and wisdom about working with elders. But are there any other resources that you would think of, Lisa?
Yeah, I have a few things going through my mind. We could probably talk after.
Okay.
I know if your family has therapy, for one, if there's OT or PT coming in, social services. My other thoughts are that we don't have enough resources in our family, and those are a lot of families struggle with that, including myself and my own recently having one that Megan went through with me with the grandparents. So I think it's a big issue and hard, and there are some. So we could talk about it after too, I think. But
Okay. So, yes, Pat.
We also have a member of our church who used to be, she's a very young, petite woman, but she is a psychiatrist, and she was head of the, for seniors, psychiatric center that used to be at our hospital, St. Luke's,
Linda?
but no longer exists. So
Okay,
she's working elsewhere. But she is a member of our church, and she would be a good resource person, I think.
Is that Linda? Is that her name?
Pardon?
Linda, is that her name? Or Belinda?
Belinda.
Yeah, she's on the board of Cooper Reese also. I didn't
Yeah.
know she was a member here.
Yeah.
She would be a great resource. Yeah.
And she plays with our bells.
Good. Anything else? Okay. All right. So if, here I'll, if you want one of these, I'll, I guess we should go and enjoy this wonderful day, if there isn't anything else. Okay. Oop. By the way, Liz and I will see you in October. Yeah.